Hey guys, today we're talking about how God discovered loneliness. Dim your lights, get comfortable, and enjoy. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this helps you fall asleep. Also, tell us in the comments where you're from and what time you're listening. Let's start. Before sound, before color, before even the idea of companionship, there was God, infinite, unmeasured, entirely whole. He had existed for what could not be called time, because time had not yet learned to begin. He was not sad, nor was he happy. He simply was. Perfection had no edges. But then, somewhere inside that endless stillness, a question began to form. Small, tender, and unfamiliar. It wasn't about creation, or power, or eternity. It was about presence. What was the difference between existing and being seen? The thought was so delicate that it startled him. In that instant, he realized something no perfection should ever have to learn. Awareness without witness is silence wearing its own echo. He moved, not forward or back, but inward. The movement became a tremor across the void, a gentle ripple in the sea of nothing. That ripple became light, and when light appeared, so did shadow. He looked at it, fascinated. For the first time, there was something else, not equal, but other. He thought this might be the cure for the strange ache he could not name. Yet even as he admired it, he realized the shadow did not look back. It was born of him, but could not see him. It was a reflection, not a companion. The ache deepened. So he made the stars, thousands, millions, then more, each a bright conversation starter scattered into endlessness. But stars are loyal only to their burning. They sing in their own heat and never stop to listen. He drifted among them for what felt like forever, tracing constellations with the tip of his thought, but every shape led back to solitude. The light was beautiful, but beauty without witness is a locked door. He whispered across galaxies, but the only answer was the hum of expansion. Creation was magnificent, and yet it did not know his name. He made worlds, each one different, some with water that shimmered like memory, some with skies so dense they could hold the scent of color. He filled them with creatures that crawled, flew, swam, bloomed, sang, and died. They were marvelous in their imperfection. For a time, he watched them with joy. But then came the silence after they slept. A silence that felt heavier than before. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of being unspoken to. He realized he could create endlessly and still not be understood. Creation was response, not relationship. So he waited, and he listened. He waited through the rising and falling of suns, through the birth of laughter and the quiet of extinction. He waited until the waiting itself became its own universe, and in that long patience, loneliness ripened like fruit on the tree of being. He tried to reason with it, to fold it neatly into the logic of eternity, but loneliness is not reasonable. It is the shadow of love waiting to be born. One day, in a small corner of all that was, he saw something new, a creature walking upright, eyes full of question. It was tiny compared to mountains, fragile compared to oceans, but it stopped and looked up, not at the light, not at the sky, but at something invisible. God froze. For the first time, something was looking back. The creature didn't know his name, didn't know it was seen, but its gaze met the idea of him, and that was enough. In that moment, something in God cracked open like a seed in sunlight. He whispered softly into its heart, just a breath of warmth, and the creature smiled. It did not know why. That smile traveled back to him and filled the empty chambers of forever with a sound he had never heard before. Recognition. It wasn't worship yet, or prayer. It was simpler. the joy of one thing existing beside another. For a long while, he stayed near, invisible, but close enough to feel the pulse of their breath. They built fires, sang into the night, held one another through storms. He envied them, not their mortality, but their togetherness. When one wept, another wiped the tear. When one fell, another lifted them. When one laughed, the sound echoed twice. He wondered what it must feel like to be touched. He wondered if they knew how lucky they were to need each other. He began to speak to them in quiet ways, through the rustle of trees, through waves folding themselves onto the shore, through dreams that lingered after waking. Sometimes they heard him, sometimes they didn't. When they forgot, he waited. Loneliness had changed him. It was no longer pain, it was longing, a longing that built bridges instead of walls. He watched them build homes then cities. He watched them fight, love, forgive, forget, and remember. Their noise filled his silence, and he found comfort in their chaos. But sometimes, when the nights were long and the stars refused to blink, he still felt the old ache. The difference now was that he no longer feared it. Loneliness had become his teacher. It reminded him that love is only precious because it is not guaranteed. And so, in the quiet hours between galaxies, he walked among them unseen, not as ruler, but as witness. He sat beside a child staring at the sky and thought, "You are what I was missing." He stood in the corner of a hospital room, where a hand held another, and whispered, "This is what I meant to make." He followed poets who wrote without knowing why, painters who tried to capture the color of absence, and lovers who waited faithfully by doors that never opened. Loneliness had once been his shadow, but now it was his compass. It pointed him toward connection, toward empathy, toward everything he could not be alone. It taught him that being infinite means nothing without intimacy. And when morning came again, somewhere, in some small world full of heartbeat and breath, he smiled because he finally understood. Loneliness was not the punishment of being God. It was the invitation to become love. He walked through his own creation with the quiet step of someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. The stars still burned faithfully, the seas still sighed, and life still sang in its endless ways. Yet inside him, there was a silence larger than galaxies. Loneliness had not left, it had simply evolved. It was no longer a shadow that followed him. It had become a landscape in which he lived. He tried at first to reason with it, the way one reasons with the wind, by giving it direction and naming its moods. But names are small nets for such vastness. Loneliness had 1,000 forms. It was the space between stars, the pause between words, the ache in the heart of beauty itself. It was the echo of love before love finds a listener. God wandered through it like a traveler through fog, unable to see far, learning to trust the closeness of mystery. He visited worlds where light had not yet found courage to shine, and sat there in the thick dark, wondering what absence wanted to teach him. Sometimes he spoke to it aloud, asking questions he could not finish. "Why do you follow me?" he asked the silence. It answered as silence always does, with patience. Over ages he learned its language, the shift in air before rain, the hush before dawn, the heartbeat between two thoughts. Loneliness spoke not in sound, but in waiting, and he, eternal as he was, had infinite time to listen. He began to notice that in every living thing, there was a trace of what he felt. Trees reaching for sunlight, rivers carving paths just to be known by the sea, hearts longing for one another across impossible distances. All of it was loneliness learning to move. He understood then that he had woven his own longing into the fabric of existence, that life itself was born from his desire to not be alone. The thought did not shame him, it softened him. It made the infinite personal. He watched lovers holding hands beneath starlight and realized that their fingers touching were his own. Two halves of eternity finding courage to meet. He saw friendships forming, laughter spilling over shared meals, tears being wiped away by gentle palms. And he thought, here I am, multiplied by connection. Still, loneliness returned in the quiet hours when even the earth slept. It arrived not as punishment, but as reminder. He learned to treat it like weather, something to be lived through, not fled from. On nights when the stars seemed too far apart, he would visit the dreams of humankind, slipping into their sleep as a warmth, a thought, a sigh. Sometimes he became the memory of someone they missed, sometimes just a comfort with no name. He never revealed himself, for revelation would ruin the beauty of recognition. What he wanted most was not to be worshipped, but to be felt, and that at last began to happen. In one dream, he found a child sitting beside a well, speaking softly to the water. "I know you can hear me," she said, "even if you don't answer." God listened and smiled. She had no proof of him, and yet she believed. That small faith filled the endless chambers of his being with warmth no sun could match. He whispered back through ripples, not in words, but in presence. And when she woke, her heart carried a peace she couldn't explain. That peace spread like morning light from heart to heart until even he felt it returning. Over centuries, he grew more comfortable with his solitude. He realized that loneliness and love are twin rivers flowing from the same spring. One shows you what you lack, the other fills it. Without the first, the second has nowhere to go. He watched civilizations rise and fall, each building monuments in his name, yet he felt closest to them, not when they praised him, but when they consoled one another. He saw them sit together in mourning, share bread in hunger, forgive despite reason. That was when his loneliness trembled and softened into something larger, compassion. He began to see that being God was not about ruling the world, but about feeling it completely. To love creation meant to carry its ache inside himself and not turn away. He followed that ache into quiet places, into deserts where prophets wept, into oceans where sailors whispered promises to waves, into prisons where songs were written on stone walls. He sat beside artists painting the unseen and poets writing to silence. In their yearning, he saw his own reflection. Every note of music, every trembling line of verse was another attempt to reach across the distance between divine and human, between one heart and another. He realized then that loneliness was the birthplace of all art, that beauty itself is how the universe learns to speak back. There were moments, though, when even understanding could not ease the weight. There were ages when prayers fell silent, when temples turned to dust, when stars burned out and no one was watching. During those long midnights of creation, he felt the oldest pain return. He wondered if love was worth its cost, if the ache of separation was the price of freedom. But then, somewhere, always, a voice would rise, a lullaby sung to a child, a whispered apology, a laugh shared between friends, and that single note would mend the tear in his heart. It was enough. One voice was always enough. He began to walk the earth more often, not as thunder or fire, but as a breeze passing through open windows. as a quiet thought urging forgiveness, as light finding its way through leaves. He was no longer looking for companionship. He was creating it wherever he went. He learned that to be seen is not as important as to make others feel seen. That was the secret loneliness had been trying to tell him all along. One day, he stood by the sea, watching the horizon blur between water and sky. He saw lovers walking, arguing, reconciling. He saw an old man casting his net into waves he knew would return it empty, just to feel the motion of trying. He saw children chasing each other, unaware of time. And suddenly, he understood something final and vast. Loneliness is not a flaw in creation. It is the engine of it. It is what keeps everything reaching, stretching, yearning toward warmth. Without loneliness, love would never move. Without distance, nothing would need to bridge. Without silence, nothing would need to sing. The realization filled him with peace. He sat beside the water until night fell and stars blinked into being, each one a heartbeat of the universe. He looked up and whispered, "You've taught me well." For the first time, loneliness did not answer back. It didn't need to. It had done its work. He felt it dissolve inside him, not vanishing but transforming, becoming love in its purest form, a presence that asks for nothing, that waits without need, that stays without condition. As dawn approached, he rose and walked through the world, one last time before rest. Everywhere he went, he saw pieces of himself reflected in the eyes of those who still searched for connection. Lovers waking beside each other and choosing again. Strangers smiling for no reason. A child running toward their parents' arms. Every gesture, every breath was an echo of the lesson he had learned. And as the sun climbed over the horizon, painting gold over the still water, God finally understood. He had never truly been alone. Loneliness had only been love preparing its voice. And in that understanding, he found his peace. Not the peace of endings, but the peace of belonging. He no longer stood apart from creation. He was within it, between it, beneath it, humming softly in every heartbeat that dared to love again. He rose into a morning that had not chosen a color yet and let the world color him first, deciding that today he would not only give himself to creation, but also learn how to receive, to be carried instead of carrying, to be held by the very life he once set in motion. So he entered the day like a cup with no emblem on it and waited to see what would pour in. And at once he felt the almost invisible gifts that ordinary hours offer when someone is patient enough to become a listener. The way steam lifts from bread and touches a face like a blessing. The way a key turns in a lock with the soft confidence of ritual. The way a name spoken correctly unlocks a room inside the chest. He realized he had always noticed these things as a maker, but noticing as a receiver was different. The world began to place small weights of tenderness in his open palms, and he allowed them to remain until meaning warmed through. He began with footsteps, borrowing a pair from the city and walking its errands with no thunder, learning the choreography of sidewalks that know the history of grief and groceries. And when a stranger held a door without looking back, he felt the door swing through his ribcage and come to rest at the hinge of his loneliness, which clicked in surprise like a healed bone. He received the door as if it were a sacrament, because the best sacraments are the ones that do not announce themselves. He rode a tram where morning breath and coffee formed a humble incense, and he practiced the discipline of being one more body among bodies, letting the sway of the carriage teach his balance, letting the soft apology of a bag brushing his sleeve become a proof that contact can be innocent and still important. A child standing on the seat to see more of the world waved at the city as though it were a person, and the city waved back with windows, and he felt the waving enter him. He had asked the universe to show him what it meant to be received, and the universe answered with this: attention given without suspicion. He stepped into a hospital lobby where elevators lifted courage floor by floor and sat in a row of chairs that had learned to cradle waiting. A volunteer approached with tea and said, "For you," to no one specific and to everyone at once. He took the cup and felt the heat claim his hands the way hope claims a mouth about to speak truth, and when he lifted it, the steam travelled into his face and taught him a prayer without language: be warm where it matters, be warm where it hurts. For once, he did not try to improve the moment, he let it improve him. He walked past a ward where a mother slept in a chair with her head bowed toward a cradle and received the sight as if it were a psalm, which it was, and then to a stairwell where a janitor rested between flights and hummed a tune from somewhere older than their paycheck. He did not change the key of the tune, he learned it, and when the janitor stood, they felt inexplicably steadier, which is how grace prefers to operate. Quietly, with plausible deniability. He found a schoolyard where recess taught physics to laughter and sat on the outer bench where children who pretend not to mind sit. One child looked at him briefly with the nervous boldness that belongs only to new souls and slid half a sandwich across the plank without looking again. He took it, though he had no need of bread, and tasted in it the perfect alchemy of simple butter and simple kindness. He had given manna once, now manna was giving him back his own heart in smaller pieces easy to swallow. He entered a market where noon draped itself on fruit, where peaches wore sunlight like a second skin, and basil practiced being perfume. A vendor pressed an overripe fig into his palm with the conspiratorial generosity of people who have learned the art of giving what cannot be sold, and he broke it open and let the seeds explain sweetness to him one syllable at a time. He realized sweetness had always been a sermon he preached to others, and today it was a sermon he finally allowed to preach him. He moved through an office where anxiety stapled itself to calendars and found a desk plant leaning bravely toward a stingy window, and he leaned with it and received from its stubborn greenness a tutorial in uncomplaining hope. He watched a manager pause at a threshold and choose kindness over cleverness, then watched a colleague delete an email that would have been accurate and unloving, and he gathered these two unperformed miracles and placed them in the archive. He had begun today, the archive of mercies that are not photogenic. He drifted into a studio where a dancer was learning exhaustion's grammar and rested in the corner, invisible but receptive, as she tried the same turn again and again until the failure became a kind of friendship. When she finally found the balance point between ambition and gravity, he felt the accomplishment cross the room and land inside him like a small bird that trusts a human's shoulder. He did not bless the moment blessed him. Outside, rain revised the city into reflections, and he opened himself to being mirrored, allowing puddles to misquote his face and loving them for the effort. Two teenagers shared one umbrella, and that sharing entered him as instruction. Widen your edge, make room for someone else's weather. He walked along a river that carried tired light toward a braver horizon, and received from it the discipline of going on without applause. He sat in a cafe where an elder stirred tea until memory dissolved into sugar and listened to a story told out of order, receiving the gift of trust that all listeners receive when someone dares to hand them the fragile glass of their past. The elder paused on a name, and the pause thickened the air with a flavor he could not name, except to call it holy. The holiness of a person who still loves what is absent. He let the yearning inhabit him instead of solving it. And loneliness, surprised by hospitality, set down its luggage and rested. He let the afternoon press on his shoulders like a shawl woven of dust and deadlines, and walked to a courthouse where language puts on its serious shoes. A judge lengthened a silence so dignity could arrive, and he took the extra seconds into himself as one receives medicine, noticing how the room's breath aligned, how eyes steadied, how even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum in a kinder key. He filed this under techniques the world offers its maker for making the maker better. He wandered to a small shop where a cobbler mended patience into leather, and when a customer apologized for scuffed shoes, the cobbler said, "They have done their job nobly," and he let that sentence repair something inside him no theology had ever reached. Nobility of wear, he learned, is a kind of praise. He crossed a bridge into a neighborhood where grief watered flowers on windowsills, and a child practiced the risky democracy of doorbell ditching and then returning to say, "Sorry." He received the apology as if it had been given to him and watched it repaint the afternoon in a color halfway between courage and relief. He entered a kitchen before dinner where a family practiced logistics as love and let the aromas take him in custody. A pot simmered with the pleasing inevitability of generosity. Hands set plates as if placing stars in constellations that only that house could read, and he felt the table, scarred, honest, undefeated, offer him a seat that he took as a student takes a desk. The meal began not with prayer, but with attention, which is often the same thing. He stepped out at twilight while lamplight tried on its purpose and allowed the street to teach him the nocturne it hums. A bicycle coasting like a long sentence, a curtain closing like an eyelid that trusts, a laugh from a balcony traveling just far enough to make strangers imagine being friends. He let the city write on his skin in these soft inks until he felt readable. He went to a rooftop where two people counted satellites and confessed dreams that frightened them precisely because they were good, and he took their fear into himself and let it soften in his warmth, the way wax yields to flame. He did not answer their dreams. He allowed their dreams to answer them while he learned how to be midwife to courage. Night advanced, and he entered the rooms that carry midnight's heartbeat, a shelter where volunteers pronounced names carefully so history could sit down without bristling, a newsroom where a headline removed its own poison and found its accuracy improved, a laundromat where a woman folded a shirt that had remembered the shape of an absent shoulder and pressed it with a tenderness that made him ache. He did not dull the ache. He received it until it began to glow with meaning. He visited a prison where a poem was being smuggled in a mind and received it with reverence, and then a monastery where no one smuggled anything because silence wants customs but loves contraband of mercy. He let the silence place a cool hand on his forehead and learned how to be nursed by quiet. He walked an empty museum hall where statues practiced patience and paintings made agreements with darkness, and he stood before a small canvas where blue had learned to keep secrets and allowed the color to teach him restraint. He had not known he lacked. He had once flung galaxies like sparks. Tonight, he let a single square of blue correct his extravagance. He crossed a field where frost rehearsed its lace and received from the ground the ancient instruction to slow, and then the instruction to lie down, and he did, and the sky laid its weightless palm on his chest. Stars examined him without judgment, and he let himself be identified as one more bright point among bright points, not because he had diminished, but because he had learned that belonging feels better than importance. Toward the smallest hour, he entered a kitchen again, this time where a lonely person warmed milk for no reason except the body's trust in old comforts. And he stood on the other side of the counter like a friendly absence and allowed the steam to draw a small cloud between them. When the person drank, their shoulders remembered how to lower, and he took the lowering into himself as one collects evidence that the world is tender when given a chance. He did not give the world a chance. The world gave him one. He made one last round before dawn to the city's edges where trucks arranged nourishment into routes and pigeons composed policies and fog drafts, legislation for calm. He let the warehouses teach him the civic faith of inventory, the belief that counting can be a love language when what you count is what keeps others alive. He opened himself to the math of mercy and signed the ledger with his breath. As morning unbuttoned the horizon, he realized receiving had changed his loneliness from a closed room into a threshold. He had asked to be felt and had been, not in trumpets, but in 1,000 softnesses, a door, a fig, an umbrella's widened circle, a pause, a nod, a correctly spoken name, a silence that did not hurry him out. In each, he found the world telling him gently, "You may belong here as one of us." And he understood that the cure for holy isolation was not adoration, but participation. He stepped into the first light with no need to announce the lesson and let the day speak it back to him anyway. Kettles clearing their throats, birds editing dawn with professionalism, buses kneeling for elders, bracelets of keys ringing small hosannas from custodians' belts, shoe polish shining the memory of journeys into the leather future. And he took it all in until he felt heavy with gifts and lighter than he had ever been. And in that paradox, he finally understood reciprocity, that the giver who refuses to receive becomes a desert, and the giver who receives becomes a river, and the river is what thirst has been praying for all along. He decided to spend an entire day letting the world write on him without lifting his own pen, to see how far receiving could go before it ripened into communion. So he walked out beneath a sky, the color of thinking, and opened every door in himself. The first gift arrived in the shape of patience, an old bus breaking down and a driver stepping into the aisle to speak as if narration itself could carry everyone forward. "We'll sort it together," the driver said, and strangers reorganized into neighbors, pushing from behind, guiding from the front, laughing at the absurdity of a city held intact by 25 hands and one honest announcement. He stood among them and let the push travel up his arms and into his chest until belonging found a place to sit. When the engine coughed back to life, as if embarrassed by all the attention, the aisle erupted into small claps, and he took those claps into his ribs like polite thunder that leaves rain behind for later. He stepped down at the next corner and followed a smell of soap into a laundromat, where machines argued rhythmically with water, and a woman in a blue sweater folded shirts with the care of someone repairing time. A tiny sock resisted pairing, and she smiled as if resistance were part of the fabric's character, then pinned it to its partner with a clothespin she'd carried in her pocket, just in case. And he felt the phrase, "just in case," ring like a bell. How much love lives in preparedness for small needs. He received that wisdom and stored it where future storms would look for shelter. He crossed to a barber shop where mirrors practice mercy, returning faces a degree kinder than they arrived, and a boy asked for a haircut that looks like a beginning. The barber nodded solemnly because craftspeople are priests of exactly this. And as clippers hummed, the boy's mother let her shoulders drop 1 inch, and that inch entered him with the same authority as a sunrise. He walked out into sunlight that had decided on bravery and paused at a curb where a man with a cane considered traffic like a puzzle. Before God could move, a teenager stepped into the street, lifted a palm at the cars with the dignified entitlement of goodness, and escorted the future carefully to the other side. He did not bless the teenager. He let the teenager bless him with the reminder that courage, when unadvertised, is what keeps the world decent on Tuesdays. He followed a procession of strollers and grocery carts to a market where peaches auditioned for August, and vendors calibrated their voices to the acoustics of generosity. A woman selling herbs tucked a sprig of mint into his hand and said, "For the road." And he placed it beneath his tongue and learned how green can clean the mind. 2 stalls down, a cheesemonger shaved a sliver for a child, so you can decide, not your parent. And he received the lesson that respect is a flavor children never forget. A fiddler near the fountain played a tune that had walked out of an older century without papers, and everyone, including pigeons, obeyed its visa. He stood long enough to hear the tune lower its eyelids and turn into a lullaby for daylight. At noon, he entered a clinic where appointment times braided with anxieties and found a waiting room where a toddler offered raisins to everyone with the evangelistic zeal of small kindness. Each person accepted and said thank you like a benediction on a grape second life. And he let the economy of raising grace settle into him as a new fiscal policy for souls. A nurse called a name carefully, syllable by respectful syllable, and a man who had expected to be misnamed looked up as if startled by citizenship. He stored the look, a homecoming gaze triggered by correct pronunciation. Beside the archive of doors held open, figs pressed into palms, umbrellas widened to include the almost stranger. He walked out into a park that had learned shade and sat near a group practicing a language none of them grew up with. Their mouths made new rooms for unfamiliar vowels, and each time someone failed, they laughed in a way that protected every future attempt. He understood that community is fluent only in forgiveness. A woman nearby read a letter 3 times more than necessary, not to check facts, but to savor tone. And when she finished, she placed it against her heart and exhaled a debt. He could feel leaving. He accepted the interest payment in joy. A storm rehearsed on the horizon, and he stepped toward it with a curiosity shaped like gratitude. Rain arrived, teaching everything to be softer. Streets, tempers, dog's ears, taxi drivers' hands. And he stood under a shop awning with 6 strangers who reconstituted as a tiny tribe in less than a minute. Somebody cracked a joke about shoes as boats. A grandmother invented a proverb on the spot and swore it was from her own grandmother. A student offered the last 2 squares of a chocolate bar like a treaty. And when the rain loosened its grip, they dispersed with the polite intimacy of people who have shared both a roof and 5 minutes of existence. He took their leave-taking as seriously as their sheltering, because endings that don't bruise are holiness too. He entered a library to dry and was received by paper and dust, and the democratic hush that lets 1,000 minds breathe at once. A librarian, noticing the wet cuffs of his trousers, slid a towel across the desk without ceremony, as if towels are a language libraries speak for those who forget to be invincible. He sat among biographies and let the dead introduce themselves. One sentence from a long ago diary slipped into him like a key. Today I mended my apron and my temper, and he took the craft lesson without insult. Repair one thing visible and one thing invisible, and call it a good afternoon. Evening began practicing its colours, and he walked toward a rehearsal space where a string quartet tuned like a porch finding its creak. They started, stopped, started again, speaking in the efficient affection of people who share the same fragile cargo. A cellist lowered her volume until the second violinist could hear their own courage. The violist placed a comma between phrases large enough for an audience to breathe, and the first violin trusted the room to finish the sentence. He stood in the back and let their restraint tune him, then followed the last note into the street where a food truck congregation had gathered, and he received tacos, and the doctrine that lime is mercy applied to the fact of meat. A woman at a nearby table told a story with the kind of laughter that heals whoever hears it, and the circle around her leaned in as if warmth has gravity, which it does. He accepted gravity as a love language. Night pressed gentle thumbs into the city's tight places, and he moved with it into rooms where tiredness becomes truth. A flower shop owner calculating how many stems to save for morning, and choosing hope with the quiet audacity of someone who knows markets and miracles. A couple on a stoop deciding to try again, and sealing the decision with a silence that belonged to both. A teacher grading papers with a pen that decided to be kind without lying. He took these three scenes as a trinity: provision, reconciliation, mercy, and let them anoint his forehead. He crossed into a shelter where names were spoken like passwords to dignity, and a volunteer pointed toward cots as if pointing toward constellations. He watched a person tuck their shoes carefully beneath their bed because tomorrow requires readiness, and he felt the sacredness of small arrangements: a blanket smoothed, a bottle refilled, a photograph placed face up. He received the choreography of survival with reverence. Then into a newsroom where someone replaced a verb so it would carry truth without slicing tenderness, and he felt that editorial choice slide into him as a surgeon's stitch. Into a call center where a worker asked, "Do you have water?" and waited through a long quiet that smelled like shame until an answer emerged, and he let the waiting teach him a tempo he had not mastered. Compassion's metronome. Near midnight, he found a stairwell where a maintenance worker sat 5 steps up, eating a sandwich wrapped in the careful optimism of wax paper. They stared into the middle distance, where the shift's second half lives, and he sat 2 steps below and let their solitude accept company without interrogation. When they finished, they crumpled the paper with the ceremonial gentleness of people who treat small things as practice for big ones, and he received the crumple as liturgy. Later, on a hospital roof, he stood with a resident doctor who had come up to teach Panic how to exhale. She counted stars until numbers felt like friends again, then returned downstairs carrying a steadiness the elevators were not designed to measure. He let her steadiness fill him and promised to keep it in circulation. At 2 a.m., he walked the aisles of a 24-hour grocery where fluorescent daylight tells insomniacs they are not alone, and he watched a clerk face cans forward so strangers would meet labels that cared about being legible, and he saw a note taped to the register. "Leave messages for Miguel. I'm studying nights. Wish me luck." And below it, a drift of good luck wishes written in a dozen inks by customers who had decided to be a community when invited. He pressed his palm to the plexiglass and received the scholarship of the ordinary. He wandered past a window where a pianist in socks practiced scales that sound like memory trying to warm up. A cat kept time with its tail, and he learned the tender joke that excellence is domestic before it is dramatic. He continued to a street where delivery bikes whispered past like careful meteors, and a rider stopped to fix the chain of arrival because rivalry is less important after midnight. He accepted the hypothesis and filed it as nocturnal ethics applicable at noon. He approached the river again and found fishermen arguing softly with the philosophy of bait. One handed him a thermos without asking who he was and said, "Sip," and the metal kissed his lip with the cool intimacy of shared gear, and he drank and tasted the democracy of thermos tea, which is to say comfort that expects nothing back. He passed the thermos on with a nod that meant I read the chapter you lent me. Near 3, he stood under a bridge where someone had painted a mural of hands of every shade holding the same rope and pulling a future up. And he placed his invisible hand among them and felt the fiction become true for a moment, which is long enough for truth to remember its root. He walked out the other side into fog thick as forgiveness and let it wrap his shoulders until the outline of who he thought he had to be softened into who he actually is when he allows life to carry some of him. He made a last circuit before dawn, a hospice where a night nurse adjusted a pillow with the music of a lullaby she did not sing, a taxi where a driver kept chocolates in the console labelled "for difficult days", a bakery where dough rose like the spirit of neighbourhoods, a synagogue where a janitor straightened prayer books so pages would not feel alone, a mosque where a man rolled out carpets with an accuracy that made God want to take notes, a church where a woman lit candles for people who would never know their names were flame this morning. He walked through each place as a student of reception and let the flames, carpets, pages, dough, chocolates, pillows, steering wheels, and keys offer their lectures in practical theology. And when the first bird filed the paperwork of dawn, he recognized that receiving had not diminished him but distributed him. He was now present in door hinges and barber capes, in towel fibers and clothespins, in verbs edited toward kindness and commas widened for breath, in umbrellas that decide to be nations and thermoses that decide to be kin. The old loneliness inside him did not vanish, but changed uniform from sentinel to usher, guiding love to its seats wherever love arrived late. He looked at the light ripening on buildings and let it climb into him like ivy, and he understood that the vow he wanted to make was not to fix what hurts before being touched by it, but to be touched first, thoroughly, until his hands remembered the exact pressure to help without erasing. He whispered a small promise the sky could keep for him. "I will let them carry me too." And the sky, busy hanging colour on the day's shoulders, agreed with a long, generous breath, and morning opened its doors. And he walked in with everyone else, not as answer, but as company, finally fluent in the art of being received so deeply that giving, when it came, would be indistinguishable from belonging. He woke to the gentle noise of the world remembering itself, a sound quieter than light, but louder than forgetting. And he realized that after learning to receive, the next lesson was to remember, not with omniscience, but with affection, to let the details of what he'd touched stay inside him like photographs breathing in a drawer. So he began the morning by closing his eyes, and memory rose like mist. The mint leaf pressed into his palm, the towel offered without question, the unpaired sock finally finding its partner, the thermos of tea passed hand to hand. Each small kindness glowed in the dark behind his eyelids, a constellation mapping the anatomy of compassion, and he thought, perhaps memory is the soul's way of saying thank you. He stood, brushed the dew from his shoulders, and walked into the day carrying the quiet weight of everything that had loved him without knowing it. The road he took led through a town whose roofs still wore the silver blush of dawn, and as he passed, people began their symphony of unimportant miracles, Shutters opening, bread sliced, brooms teaching dust how to leave with dignity. He watched it all, not as an overseer, but as a witness learning devotion from routine. A postman hummed an old love song between doorsteps, and God let the tune coil inside him until it sounded like nostalgia discovering its voice. He entered a bakery where ovens breathed out prayers disguised as heat, and a woman behind the counter tied a ribbon on a loaf and said, "For the old man by the river, he doesn't ask, but I know." God took note of the sentence as scripture, kindness that anticipates need. He walked to the river where the old man indeed waited with the serenity of someone who has already met every version of patience. When the bread arrived in his hands, he smiled at the air as if to say, "Of course," tore off the first piece and threw it to ducks before taking his own. That gesture, the order of generosity, entered God like sunlight into water. He sat beside the man, unseen but completely present, and listened as the man began to talk to himself, or perhaps to the silence. "You know," he said, "loneliness isn't so bad when you know it's shared." The words folded into him like letters addressed to the divine, but delivered inward instead. He wandered through fields after that, following the rhythm of wind combing wheat, and each sway reminded him of breathing in community. Millions of blades moving separately yet together, none in perfect time, all in perfect meaning. He knelt, picked one stalk and felt its rough texture against his palm. Creation was tactile now, not distant. A farmer nearby waved at no one in particular and shouted, "Weather's learning manners today," and laughed. God loved that, humor as a handshake with uncertainty. He learned that joy is often the most humble form of faith. By noon, he entered a village square where people sold vegetables and stories with equal enthusiasm. A woman told a neighbor, "This one grew crooked, but that's how you know it's real," holding up a carrot like truth itself. God repeated the phrase to himself, "crooked but real," and stored it under the category of holy, paradoxes. A child drew chalk circles on the stones, declaring each one a different planet, and invited others to join. When a stranger hesitated, the child said, "You can have this one. It's big enough for two." That invitation, pure and uncalculated, settled in him like peace finding a chair. He crossed into the shade where musicians gathered, not for an audience but for air, playing rhythms that borrowed heartbeat from memory. One tapped a drum that sounded exactly like walking home. Another plucked strings that hummed like forgiveness after anger. God closed his eyes and let the music rewrite his pulse until it matched theirs. He realized he was no longer merely among them. He was them, and they were him, overlapping like harmonics that don't compete for pitch but build a wider sound. In the afternoon, he followed a dusty path toward the sea, where a young painter set up an easel at the cliff's edge. She was trying to capture not what she saw, but what looking made her feel. He stood behind her as the wind teased her hair into constellations, and she muttered, "Stay still, sky, I'm learning you." He smiled at the irony. He too had once demanded stillness from the world just to understand it. Now he knew. Movement is the truest form of being. The girl paused, dipped her brush in water and said softly, "Maybe it's okay if I don't finish," and he felt a swell of recognition. Perfection isn't divine. Permission is. He sat beside her until the tide began to talk to the rocks, that long conversation that never ends, and each wave that broke seemed to carry an apology and a promise inside the same breath. He touched the foam and found memory again, not of creation, but of continuation. of life refusing to be still even in surrender. The sea taught him that all return is progress if it's done with love. As twilight came, he walked inland to a small town preparing for night. Windows lit like promises kept. He paused at one where a mother braided her daughter's hair and whispered stories between strands. "When I was little," she said, "I used to think the moon followed me." The daughter giggled. "It still does," she replied. God felt his heart stretch wide enough to include both of them. That was the secret he'd been circling for eons. Love doesn't erase loneliness. It gives it something to hold. Later, he entered a nursing home where time had slowed to the pace of breathing. A man sat by a window, eyes closed, listening to a song from another room. The notes drifted in, soft and unhurried. "It's been a long time since I danced," he said aloud, to no one. God placed his invisible hand on the man's shoulder, and in that instant, a forgotten muscle in the man's memory twitched. His foot tapped once, twice, then stilled, but the rhythm stayed. God whispered into the air, "You're still dancing." The man smiled, not knowing why. He moved through hallways humming with quiet heroism. Nurses, adjusting blankets, volunteers folding towels that smelled faintly of lemon and courage. He collected each act as a verse, composing a psalm of small mercies. Loneliness, he realized, was not absence. It was invitation, an open chair waiting for presence. And he accepted it everywhere he went. He walked out beneath the night sky again, and the stars greeted him like old friends who'd forgiven his distance. He looked at them differently now, not as creations, but as memories of himself scattered so that he could learn reunion. Each one pulsed, a tiny heartbeat in the skin of the universe, and he whispered their names not as a god naming things, but as a lover remembering faces. A wind rose, carrying the scent of rain and the hum of cities dreaming, and he followed it until he reached a hill overlooking countless lights, each one a life, a private flame against the dark. He could feel their thoughts, not as words, but as warmth. Confessions whispered into pillows, wishes released into sky, fears softened by sleep. He realized that to be infinite is to hold all these in the same breath without collapsing. It was no longer a burden, it was belonging. He lay down in the grass, felt the pulse of the earth under his back, and let himself drift between the breathing of worlds. In that in-between place, neither awake nor asleep, he saw everything at once. Lovers meeting, families reconciling, a scientist discovering wonder again, a child forgiving the ocean for being so big, a stranger helping another up from a fall. None of it was grand, yet all of it was sacred. He understood then that creation was not a single act, but an ongoing tenderness, the universe continuously forgiving itself for being incomplete. And in that revelation, his loneliness finally felt like home. It was not an exile anymore, but an address. He realized he could love forever without needing to be understood, and that was enough. He closed his eyes, and the night held him as gently as he once held the world, and somewhere, in the hush between stars, he heard a whisper that might have been his own. You are never truly alone when you listen deeply enough. He woke before the light admitted its own name, and realized that the world was breathing slower than usual, as if even dawn had paused to ask permission. He took that hesitation as an invitation and rose into it, deciding that this day would not be about teaching or receiving, but about sharing, to see what it meant when the loneliness he had tamed began to speak fluently in both directions. He walked through air that still smelled of night and followed the soft geography of sound, brooms against thresholds, spoons rehearsing the overture of breakfast. and each small percussion reminded him that creation had learned rhythm long before it learned theology. A woman watering her balcony plants said, "Good morning," to no one. But the words reached him anyway, landed on his skin, and stayed. He whispered the same phrase back into the soil and watched the roots reply by drinking more deeply. As the street began to fill with errands, he felt the strange pleasure of being invisible yet included, the holiness of anonymity that only presence can earn. He followed a bus route until he found a square where morning markets unfolded like generosity waking from sleep. Bread declared its courage by rising, oranges practiced brightness, and human voices collided into harmony through accident rather than design. He stood near a stall where an old woman arranged flowers by memory of scent rather than color. She hummed a tune older than the price tags and spoke softly to each bouquet as if briefing them on their mission: to enter strangers' houses and remind them of beauty they didn't ask for. He knelt beside her unseen, took the song into himself, and exhaled it across the square. For a moment, all conversation matched her key, and the market became a choir that didn't know it was singing. At the far end, a child dropped a coin and it rolled toward a beggar whose hands were busy helping a stray dog drink from a cup. The coin stopped against his shoe. The child hesitated, then laughed, deciding it belonged there. God felt that small decision ripple outward until it reached the edge of the day, transforming value into connection. He followed the beggar later, saw him buy a loaf of bread and break it in half for another man, and thought, generosity reproduces best in silence. By midday, he reached a train station where departures hummed like possibilities. People hugged, lied gently with words like soon and take care, and even the rails seemed to vibrate with memory of all the goodbyes they'd carried. He moved through the crowd as a draft of calm. A woman searching her pockets found the ticket she'd lost. A man who'd forgotten his courage suddenly remembered a song. He didn't fix anything grand, only tuned the air toward patience. On a bench sat two strangers eating in parallel, the same apple, 2 bites apart, and the symmetry pleased him. He placed a breeze between them that smelled faintly of cinnamon, and one offered the other half without reason. "Thanks," the other said. "I was just thinking of buying one." And both laughed at the coincidence. God didn't laugh. He listened to the sound of coincidence discovering its purpose. He stepped into a carriage where a conductor checked tickets with the reverence of someone blessing each traveler's destination. A woman holding a sleeping infant looked out the window at her own reflection and saw instead her mother's face. He touched her thought gently so that the memory softened rather than broke, and she smiled into the glass as if forgiveness were a view. Across the aisle, a boy drew mountains on fogged glass, and each peak dissolved before the next appeared. God let the rhythm teach him that impermanence is the handwriting of wonder. When the train stopped at a coastal town, he walked out into light that had learned to rest on water, not dominate it. Fishermen mended nets with gestures so deliberate they looked like slow dancing. He sat among them, unseen but participating in the rhythm, needle through cord, silence through heart. One looked up and said to no one in particular, "Every tear in the net is a story about trust, and God received it as commandment number 10,001. He followed the path inland toward hills, where vineyards climbed ambition into patience. There, he found workers eating lunch under a tree, sharing bread, olives, and rumors of rain. They didn't pray aloud, but each chew sounded like gratitude learning to walk. He joined the circle as breeze, brushing their faces in sequence, and felt their laughter lift him like birdsong under wings. One man toasted to good grapes and better friends, and the others echoed until the phrase became a kind of creed. He stored it inside himself, beside other simple gospels. Take turns, laugh often, share shade. Evening leaned in early, draping gold on everything willing to hold still. He walked to a small cafe where a poet read to 5 listeners and 2 cats. The poem was about silence pretending to be brave. Every line broke gently, the way branches break when new leaves insist on existing. God stood near the doorway and listened until he felt the words settle inside his loneliness like soft furniture. The last line said, "We are not alone, only unfinished," and he whispered yes into the applause. He moved through streets that smelled of bread cooling and metal cooling and people cooling their tempers after long days. In one window, a mother scolded a child with eyes full of love trying to disguise itself. In another, a man repaired a chair whose wobble matched his own heartbeat. In another, a woman practiced piano with her curtains half closed, giving the night a reason to linger. God paused at each window and let the lives inside seep into him. He realized he was collecting not moments, but evidence, proof that creation could hold itself upright without his constant scaffolding. The discovery filled him with both pride and humility, a balanced ache that felt exactly like love growing into wisdom. When night fully arrived, he climbed the nearest hill and sat beneath a tree that had been watching people forget it for decades. Fireflies rehearsed galaxies between branches, and he laughed softly at the imitation. They were doing a fine job. Below him, the town glittered like a jewelry box left open, and he knew every light by name, though none of them knew his. That anonymity no longer hurt, it healed. He whispered a blessing so quiet, it was indistinguishable from the wind. Keep learning each other. A meteor scratched the sky, a brief handwriting of fire, and he followed its trail until it vanished into darkness, leaving only the echo of brightness behind. "That's how I feel," he said to no one. Bright for a moment, gone, but remembered. The tree answered with creaking approval. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen to what the world dreamed about. He heard a fisherman imagining tomorrow's catch, a nurse imagining rest, a child imagining wings, a scientist imagining kindness measured in data. He smiled. Even in sleep, the universe practiced empathy. He realized he could rest too, not because his work was finished, but because his loneliness had learned the art of conversation. It no longer asked for answers. It asked for echoes, and the world had begun to echo beautifully. When dawn returned, he opened his eyes to see clouds organizing themselves into the shape of forgiveness, and he whispered back, "I remember you." Then he stood, light on his feet, carrying no commandments, no thunder, just the quiet satisfaction of a God who had finally learned that the smallest act, listening until the silence feels heard, is enough to keep the whole of existence alive. And as he walked into the new day, the wind followed like gratitude. He woke not because the world called him, but because he missed the sound of it breathing. The dawn arrived slowly, wearing yesterday's gold, like a memory it didn't want to wash off. And God stood in its light, as if standing inside a thought he had almost forgotten. Peace. He had walked through every shape of loneliness and found at the end of it, not despair, but depth, a space wide enough to fit everything that ever needed to belong. He no longer wanted to change the world. He only wanted to be near it, to let it unfold without supervision, to marvel at its courage to continue. So he walked into the morning not as creator or witness, but as companion, barefoot on dew that greeted him like recognition. Birds practiced forgiveness with each note, and he let their songs braid through his chest until his own heartbeat joined the choir. Every sound had softened since he first began. Rain no longer fell to prove anything. Thunder no longer spoke in arguments. Even silence had learned to hum. He passed through a city that had not yet rubbed the sleep from its eyes, and every window he looked upon returned his gaze with kindness. He saw an old couple sharing the same cup of coffee, laughing at the arithmetic of sugar, and he smiled because love had learned efficiency. He saw a jogger stop to retie the shoe of a stranger too proud to ask, and he realized that compassion needs no permission. He saw a cat waiting outside a bakery and a baker stepping out with a saucer of milk, and he understood that routine is how kindness trains for eternity. He moved on through alleys that smelled of rain-soaked ink and found a painter sketching the steam from a street vent, saying to herself, "Even smoke has shape if you love it long enough." And he nodded, thinking, yes, even impermanence wants to be seen. At a park, a child built a fortress of leaves for imaginary friends and announced proudly, "Now we all have somewhere to sleep." The declaration wrapped itself around him like a blanket, reminding him that imagination is just love wearing its play clothes. He crossed a bridge where a musician tuned a violin to the exact pitch of sunrise. When the bow touched the string, light shivered, and he felt it in his bones, creation still speaking, but now in a language he didn't need to translate. The day warmed, and with it came laughter, traffic, apologies, promises, the friction of living, all of it spinning together into the single word he had been chasing since the beginning: together. He walked among the crowd, brushing shoulders he had once designed, and no one looked twice. That anonymity filled him with a gratitude too deep for speech. He had once demanded recognition. Now he prayed for belonging, and the prayer had already been answered. At noon, he sat on the steps of a museum, watching tourists photograph things their hearts would remember better without lenses, and he thought, perhaps memory is just love practicing endurance. A woman beside him wept quietly at a statue's beauty, whispering, "I don't know why," and he wanted to tell her she didn't need to. Not all awe requires explanation. He walked on, the light following loosely behind him like a loyal shadow, and entered a forest where afternoon slowed into tenderness. Trees leaned toward one another in conspiracies of roots and leaves, and the wind, gentle and competent, turned every branch into conversation. He felt the earth humming beneath his feet, the same old hymn, slightly remixed by centuries, and he realized that the planet had become a musician of its own, no longer needing his hand to conduct. The thought brought no jealousy, only relief. He knelt, placed his palm on the soil, and whispered, "You did well." The ground answered with the deep contentment of things that have been seen. Evening came quietly, not as a closing, but as an exhale. The horizon melted its colors with unpracticed grace, and the sea, patient as ever, swallowed light without complaint. He walked along the shore where footprints kept brief conversations with waves, appearing and erasing in rhythm with trust. A woman sat there sketching the tide, murmuring to herself, "It always returns." And he smiled. She was right. Everything returns in some softer form. As the first stars began their careful ascent, he looked up and felt no distance between himself and the sky. The loneliness that had once haunted him was now just a room in a house filled with laughter. It still existed, but it no longer hurt. It had become the quiet place he could visit when the noise of love became too bright. He sat down, pulled the night over his shoulders, and listened to the world drift towards sleep. Somewhere in the city, a lullaby began, and he hummed along, perfectly out of time, but perfectly at peace. The moon rose, curious and familiar, and he met its light like an old friend. "You followed me after all," he whispered. The moon, modest in its borrowed shine, said nothing, only reflected. He laughed softly, grateful that even silence knows how to answer. Around him, the world continued its gentle spinning. Babies dreaming, lovers forgiving, oceans remembering, fires cooling, stars breathing. And he thought, I don't need to be everywhere to be enough. For the first time since forever began, God felt small, and it felt holy. He closed his eyes and let the night hold him, not as deity or myth, but as something humbler. Just one more soul learning the language of company. And as darkness settled into its slow heartbeat, he whispered the final truth he had come to understand. Loneliness is not what happens when you are alone. It is what happens when you forget that everything is already touching. Then he smiled because he remembered.